and I am the Senior Director of the Port of Seattle's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Our office has been in place for 2 years. I want to start our meeting today with a land acknowledgement. The Port of Seattle exists on Indigenous land. We acknowledge the ancestral homelands of those who walked here before us and those who still walk here. Keeping in mind the integrity of this territory where Native people identify as Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Puyallup, as well as the tribes of Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and other Coast Salish people and their descendants. We are grateful to respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. This land acknowledgement is one small act in the ongoing process of working to be in good relationship with the land and the people of the land. Welcome to today's training on the Port's new Equity Index. I'm excited to see so many people joining us from around the country and our own state of Washington and King County here today. And I'm thrilled that we're able to make this cutting edge tool accessible for everyone. In just a moment, I'm going to hand things over to the star of today's show, Allison Beeson, who's the Senior Data and Policy Analyst for the Office of Equity. But first, I want to briefly talk about the Port's EDI work and the importance of the Equity Index. A little over 2 years ago, in June of 2019, the Port of Seattle became the first port authority in the country to establish a dedicated Office of Equity. In doing so, the Port of Seattle made an initial commitment of time and resources to embed equity, diversity, and inclusion in the fabric of the organization. Also, by creating this office, the Port acknowledged that for too long, we have benefited from white dominant culture and comfortably operated in an unjust and racist society. And by failing to acknowledge these inequities, we play a role in perpetuating them. The Port is committed to doing better. We're committed to becoming an equitable and anti-racist organization, and there's a lot of work ahead of us to truly realize this goal. And the focus of today's session is part of that work. For the past 2 years, one of the Port's central strategies has been to provide equitable and tangible benefits to Port-impacted communities of color and immigrant and refugee communities. The Equity Index will help us do just that. As you'll learn from Allison Beeson, we developed this index to help our organization better understand things like variation in pollution exposure, access to economic opportunities, and the overall standard of living in the communities that we serve. We're using this tool to equitably guide funding decisions and broadly inform other policy decisions across the organization. This data is making us better equipped to serve our communities by directing resources and programming for those in need. By making this important tool available to all of you, we can work together and within our communities to dismantle the barriers so historically oppressed communities, particularly communities of color, have access to the resources that they need to thrive. So without taking any more time, please let me introduce to all of you to Allison Beeson. She's our amazing, brilliant senior data and policy analyst. She's a scientist who is extremely good at what she does, and the Port of Seattle is very lucky to have her. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy this session. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions.
Hey, Reed, come and do your homework.
Address it. Oh, somebody needs to do their homework. We'll put everyone on mute. Thank you all so much, and turning it over to Allison.
Thank you, Bukta. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited. There's a lot of people here. Sometimes I feel like I work in my own bubble, but I love to see when there's other people very interested about this work. So Welcome, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Port of Seattle's Equity Index and explain to you how we're using it and what kind of feature that we have on future applications. As Book has said, and as Jay has put in the chat, this bit will be recorded and available on YouTube at the Port of Port of Seattle's YouTube page. So if you want to pass it along to anyone else, you'll be able to see that also. Also, you can ask for questions in the chat feature or raise your hand. And please turn off your mics if you're not talking. You can use the chat feature with using that little bubble up in the corner on the top of your screen, or you could raise your hand. You can see a little maybe icon with a hand raised, and you'll be able to mute yourself, muting the microphone. So you're just kind of like how to work Teams. Teams has not been the best for me right now, but we are all trying to work it out as we've been working remotely for a few of us. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to interrupt me in a chat, or if you just want to turn off your mic and you feel more comfortable talking, I am fine with that also. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, our methods, overview of the index, next steps, and then a demonstration on how to use that web application. So let's think about it. What is equity? What is influence? What is the influence of your wealth and well-being? We've talked about how there are socioeconomic factors and physical environment, your health, behavior, and healthcare. And this was a wonderful image that I got from a previous presentation that I had. And I love the fact that socioeconomic factors are really important when it comes to like your well-being and your standard of living. And then the physical environment around you. And as we just have demonstrated and seen during COVID, the healthcare that's surrounded around you. So I'm not going to assume everyone understands kind of equity in this room. So I'm just going to demonstrate and tell you a little bit about how I see equity. One of the things I emphasize is COVID. During the COVID, we've known that there's been two communities. And if you were on a scale through 1 through 10, 10 being that you're the most impacted, 1 being that you're least impacted about economic stress, environmental stress, or health stress, that when those things occur during COVID, when you have job loss, mental health, or physical elements, you're pushed to the most impacted communities. You're pushed how it's affecting your life. And so if you started at a scale of 8 and you had those 3 things happening to you, you're at a 10 and above. But if you started at a 5 in life, you're just at the level that some communities were at their starting level at an 8 or 7. During COVID, if we think about equality, you think about how the stimulus check happened. If you gave the stimulus check, if you know anything about the $1,200 that they gave out initially, they gave it to a cutoff at a certain numeric value of your income. So let's say if you made $250,000, or if you made $50,000, or if you made $20,000 that year, quality would be that everyone got the stimulus check. And so if everyone got the stimulus check, sometimes with those burdens that I was telling you about, the economic recovery, trying to lower pollution burden, healthcare, that some people are just getting back to that 8 stress level, while others are at a comfortable level at a 4 or 5, if we gave everyone the stimulus check. But with equity is prioritizing the most impacted communities. And so as we saw again during COVID, when you emphasize and prioritize those communities and gave the people that were the most impacted during COVID that $1,200 stimulus check, we're trying to get people at a level, even level field. Meaning that equity to me is understanding that we have to, as a jurisdiction, do the extra effort to get people to the same level where we're all starting at the same time. What we've been doing in Washington State, which I'm very proud of, we've done a few things when it looks at equity. We've looked at the HEAL Act, which is the Healthy Environment for All Act, and it's embedding mapping. It's in creating a Office of Equity at a very high level from the state's level. We also created an environmental disparities map. We're really looking at environmental justice from Governor Inslee, which is very incredible. and looking at creating a map for the state, which was really in partnership with UW, with Esther Ming, who was a wonderful postdoc doing her dissertation, and she created a map that was statewide looking at environmental factors. Also, is working with community, understanding the community's needs and understanding what is impacted them for when it comes to environmental justice or equity, which are two different things, but they do have a lot of similarities involved. And so I love the fact with Washington State, we've been using this on a state level, looking at equity and mapping. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how and why I developed a map just for the city port of Seattle. So the basis I like to give people so we're all on the same playing field is like, what is an index? I think it's very confusing. It's like, I don't understand, but I think we're very familiar with indexing in our life. We have the BMI index, which is a relationship between your weight and height. You have a wind chill index, which is the relationship between wind and temperature, speed of wind and temperature. I like saying the Big Mac index is the one that I think is just like the cutest in the world. And the Big Mac index is looking at the value of a Big Mac in different countries to understand what is the relationship of a currency. So if a Big Mac costs $1 in the US, but costs $2 in Korea, like how do you understand the relationship of currency and value? And an index methodology that I'm very familiar with and we're using with the Port of Seattle is the Best Colleges USA News ranking for schools and colleges. And so that is combining multiple data points, combining them and aggregating them into one scoring, and then you're able to prioritize and look and weigh different schools. And so we are looking at weighing different census block groups. And the key word is everything is relative. So what is the Port of Seattle's index? It's a mapping tool. This is something that helps leverage our resources, which I'll give you examples. We identify opportunities for communities where they can have input and understanding where they have been disadvantaged or historically marginalized in communities. And I always make sure my data is accurate and advance equity. One of the things that I make sure with every data point, each data point has at least 4 peer-reviewed papers that associates that data point with equity. And that is very important. When I talked about partnerships in the previous slide, I have been working with various jurisdictions and entities within Washington State to maybe we can understand like what is the data standardization that we have that we define what is an equity data point, and we have those conversations on a yearly basis. So again, my starting point is creating a GIS shapefile, but also a user-friendly site. I think those two things are very important. A GIS shapefile is really for your audience of analysts and government people that are very familiar with ArcGIS and understanding how to layer information. But community just sometimes just want to know about their community and understanding where the disparities are or what just information, basic demographic information about their community. So making sure there's 2 different websites. Also having internal stakeholders to make sure you align with your jurisdiction's mission and vision, but also making sure that you have buy-in from your employees and your various departments. And so those are the analysts and the government entities that I always make sure that are part of my resources in my audience. And then community. I think we all understand that community input is a very big thing for buy-in for them to be able to use this. And that's why we're doing this webinar at a very big level for anyone from the outside, because we want anyone to be able to use this resources and commit and advance equity or just how they prioritize resources in maybe a small nonprofit. So a little bit of things I like to explain about why is this a little bit different and what is my philosophy going forward. I say there's some do's and don'ts. I don't blame and I don't shame, and I identify my faults and I use accurate data. Don't blame or shame, meaning don't blame or shame communities about how you kind of pick your data points. When I say identify my faults, I quote unquote say I'm part of the man, I'm part of the system, and I understand that there are certain jurisdiction decisions made internally that is our fault. As in, we can talk about redlining, we could talk about freeways, we could talk about how we've done eliminated libraries. And so you make sure that when you use data points, you use data points that are your control, or not even your jurisdiction, but let's just say government jurisdiction's control. Some examples that I use is that when I think about not shaming, I think about color association. I think that we're very familiar again with redlining and what that means. Or when I say about information that I control, I'm thinking about transit access. I'm thinking about diesel emissions. I'm thinking about traffic density. I'm thinking about restrictions to sidewalks, why some areas have sidewalks, why some don't, which results in runoff. And so those are the things that I try to figure out what I can control and what I can't control. And those are how I kind of pick my data points. A little bit about why I emphasize color association. I identify as Black, not African American. And I love that the dictionary.com changed their definition of Black, because at the beginning, maybe around 3 or 4 years ago, if you looked up the word Black in the dictionary, it came at the very beginning with negative descriptions, as in soiled or bad or stained with dirt. And that is not something that I want to be associated with. So they rearranged that definition where they explained that Black is identity, and they made that up front, and they were able to put those negative tones at the bottom. Again, data and color association. Another thing I think about is unconscious bias when we're thinking about data and association. One of the things I emphasize, and I like to kind of go on my little soapbox, is that we need people of color in STEM. Without people of color in STEM, you get this unconscious bias sometimes that does not come across very well. One of the things is, one time there was a congressman that was accused that math was racist. And they had an article that was in Nature magazine, which is peer reviewed, which I really respect. And it was everybody was defending and understanding that we're not saying that math is racist, but we're saying that the software development, so people that develop that have unconscious bias sometimes. For example, at the beginning of Google Image, if you were looking for a wedding garb, that wedding garb, if you Google Image, it would have a white woman in a white outfit or a white dress. And it wasn't that Google Image had malice intent to it. It was just the software developers had unconscious bias. And when they were feeding those images into Google Image, they were just accustomed to what one thing looked like, which is a white woman in a white garb. It was understanding that you had a more diverse employees or software techs, that they would feed other images. And so what would happen is an Indian woman in her traditional garb was labeled as a costume and not a wedding outfit. And it wasn't, again, it wasn't out of malice. It was just unconscious bias, because people are not aware sometimes of other cultures and how to feed that software. So that's why I always like, when we think about equity and mapping and data, to have a person of color in the room to understand about how color association sometimes is offensive, how sometimes people are not aware of some things, and having that kind of dialogue about data and not just picking the standard points of data. What is different about the Port of Seattle's Equity Index? It has 4 determinate categories that is aligned with our century agenda. It makes sure that we have a racial demographic overlay. One of the things I've seen in the community of equity and data analysis is incorporating people of color or people that speak a second language as a negative data point. I do not think that me as a Black woman is a negative data point. I think that we need to understand is the resources surrounded us, meaning where I live, that have been limited to me, meaning I'm limited to transportation, public transportation. I am limited to libraries. I'm limited to good schools. I am limited to jobs in proximity to me. I'm limited to parks around me. But it's not just the fact that I'm a Black woman that this has happened. It's the fact that jurisdictions or entities above me has decided when they do a planning or zoning that this is how they make those decisions. So I make a racial demographic overlay on top of the equity index. So how does it align with our century agenda in the 4 categories? We have accessibility, economy, environment, and livability. Accessibility is defined to me as things are above and beyond your standard of living, meaning having access to parks, having proximity to healthy foods, having proximity to bike facilities or walking streets. Economy is a big thing with the Port of Seattle because we provide one of the most livable wage jobs in the region. And so we want to make sure that that was a forefront because we want to invest in economic growth in our areas. Environment, we are trying to be the greenest and most energy efficient port in North America. So we make sure that environment was like 1/4 of our data points to align. And livability, I think that we all understand what is your standard of living, what demonstrates a safe and healthy standard of living, as in housing, ownership, and transit access. So we made sure that our port was relative to our area and aligned with our mission and century agenda. So I won't go into all the social determinants, but we have accessibility, which is again above the standard of living that you have. Internet access is one of those, but I think that's quickly moving on to being a standard of livability, meaning as we've demonstrated during COVID, internet is very important. And I think that's something that I would move above in my next iteration of it. Environment, we made sure we make sure that we looked at traffic density, diesel emissions, and average PM 2.5. Livability, looking at can you sustain a household and can you use public transportation to get to that house? I mean, to get to that job and your graduation rate. And economy. Another thing about all these social determinant in these categories, they're equally weighed. I have not seen anything that shows that one data point outweighs and affects your life different than the others. I've done some research, but if anyone has any information, I would love to have a conversation with you about how to weigh those. But I understand that that's happening in the community about how to weigh certain data points versus others. Any questions thus far? Okay. Speeding through. I love speeding through. So how are these distributed? Well, they're distributed in quantiles, basically 20, 20, 20, 20, 20%. The thing that you need to understand is that we're not trying to get everyone to the middle ground. There will always be a mean. There will always be a low category or very low category or a very high category. We say opportunity, meaning opportunity. Do you have access to the opportunity to succeed in life, to excel in life, go beyond or get above the standard of living? And so sometimes we use, it's called data distribution, and we try to show like how many data points are you from that mean? Because maybe it's just like voting registration is 90% in one census block and voting registration is 92, but you're now from moderate to very high. It could sometimes be just 2 percentages, but it's distributed in quantiles based off the Z-score. So this is what the Port of Seattle's equity value looks like, the equity index. It is put into very low to very high. And what, again, when I was saying about an overlay of racial demographic information, is that you can see the darker spots are a higher percentage of white non-Hispanics in the area versus the smaller or more diverse communities. And so what I like about this is that you can see the direct correlation of where resources are limited in more diverse communities and resources, there's abundance of resources or very high opportunity to succeed or excel in life where there's a more higher population of white non-Hispanics in the area. I think the next iteration would be also overlaying this with people with having English as a second language to show how maybe those people are isolated in communities too. So this is what the online tool looks like. We have a landing page, which I'll show and demonstrate you in a minute. And then immediately when you get to the page, it shows you all of King County. There's an overview that is not included in the equity score, but it is really useful for when you're trying to analyze a community, thinking about what kind of languages to translate, what is that community. So it's just an overview page, so you get a very baseline of the community. And then there's the four categories into each of these. Yes, there's a question or a hand raise.
Good morning. This is Natasha Walters from the city of Shoreline. I understand what you're saying about the what did you call it? A marker, or I'm not sure I'll just get in the middle of it. So there's always seems to be a direct positive correlation between race and low income. You're talking about limited English speaking, and where those low opportunity areas are. And I understand you're doing the overlay, but if there's always, by and large, a positive correlation, is that just to be assumed? I mean, isn't that kind of like a duh? Like that's does that make sense?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
we're looking at that. It's like, well, we'll just use the census data because that's easy to use. Building this is a lot harder. There's a positive correlation. So is it a surrogate? Does that make sense?
A little. I think and let me know if I don't answer this correctly.
Okay.
I think we get the poverty rates and 50% or more minority communities based off, I think, the FAA, and when they look at the EPA on how to identify quote unquote vulnerable populations. I like to say historically marginalized communities. And it sometimes, I think, to us it's a duh, but it's not sometimes, because I like doing it by census block group, because you could sometimes see those pockets. And sometimes, as in, there's certain communities that have limited resources. Like this is a very low area, and they are a very high percentage of white non-Hispanics in the area. So it's still that community has been disenfranchised or have not had resources in that community. So it's not something that we should dismiss in that community also. Again, I say we lead with race first, but it is something that you need to think about, like, how do we discover these pockets that, again, this is another one, a pocket that is a high percentage of white non-Hispanics, but again, they have very low opportunity or limited resources in their area. There is something that maybe we should not forget or or not include when we think about analysis. But also we know that the majority of the people who are the majority of the diverse communities are in these lighter, very low opportunity areas. So I totally agree with that. But I don't work on kind of like the duh. I would say like, oh, duh, that makes totally sense, because I like having these conversations based on data, because usually people can't dismiss it. So when I say like there's no public transportation in this area, there's very limited high school graduations in this area, there is no proximity to jobs in this area, and guess what? Somehow we decide to do those zonings and limit those buses and remove those libraries in these neighborhoods. Why is that? Again, I heard about the census data. I try to use very limited information when it comes to census. I try to really work with my regional partners and the jurisdictions I work in to make, again, for that buy-in, to make sure that my partners see themselves. So if I'm talking about sidewalks and aerial ways, I want to get that from Public Works. If I'm talking about bus transit, I want to get that from Metro Transit. I want them to see most of themselves in the work, and it's just easier to get people to use this as a tool to use in their own day-to-day. Yes, Bukta.
Allison, I think you are already answering the questions in the chat, but I just wanted to highlight that there are 3 questions. One is about flight paths and whether flight paths are one of the indicators in the map. The second question is about the census data, if you've used it. And the third one is about how often are you going to update the map?
Thank you. We plan on updating yearly. We are working with Community Attributes, who's worked with me in the past, which is really helpful. They help usually aggregate and disaggregate that data. Actually, for the people that are locally in the King County area, we are working on to redistribute and re-aggregate that data so it's relative to just your city sometimes. So if you don't have like a analyst or a GIS team on your department, that if we can do it King County wise, that you can make it relative to just your neighborhood so you can understand what is the relationship of that distribution of data is just for your city or town. And then also with the census, again, I try to use less than 50% of my data from census. Again, want a lot of buy-in. And for the CTAC flight patterns, that is available online. And for people that are very familiar with ArcGIS, we have keep this equity index available in a shape file that if you wanted to add that layer, you can gladly add that layer because it's all public information. We are thinking about other options on how to look at flight pattern and noise, but right now for the first iteration, we just really wanted to focus on those 4 categories. But an overlay of flight patterns, I do think is something that would be very interesting to analyze. Any other questions? So let me give you some examples about how can you use data and mapping to make decision making. Well, if you're familiar, I would say one of the great things is like policy decision making. Example that I've had other people use is like placement of noise monitors. When we get a request of noise monitor placements, understanding like how do you prioritize that noise monitor placements and how do you understand like what communities want that. Another one is Public Works one time used a map and they used it to say, how are they going to place lights when they have limited money to only place 1/3 of the lights that they had a budget for? So they use their own data points looking at high traffic at night. They looked at accidents at night. They looked at also looked at safe schools, and then they used the Z-score of the index to understand like how to add additional points to prioritize those communities. Another one that I think is very interesting is if you've heard participatory budgeting, they used it to understand like how to identify communities. One of the things that they looked at was understanding they wanted people that had very low voting participation rates, communities that had high internet access, and they wanted communities that were very diverse. And this was a really good one-stop shop. Another one that happened during COVID is that the equity index was used about where to place vaccination sites, about where were those vulnerable communities that had a high rate. They use high affection rates as an overlay, but then understand where was those vulnerable communities that were being affected by COVID vaccine and placing those vaccination sites in their communities. So that is another way that people have been able to use this in various ways from the Puget Sound region. So one of the things that I really like about the index is that, again, and I'll demonstrate that in the live demo, is that we look at, I keep emphasizing jobs because the Port of Seattle provides one of the most livable wage jobs in our area. And this, we were able to dwell down into just the city of Kent. And then you were able to look into the economic data and understand what was the estimate job totals. And so we provide a lot of industry jobs, and we wanted to help work on those industry jobs in construction and manufacturing. So you can use this information to say, like, we have a city grants program, and we wanted to invest in manufacturing construction. And so this was a tool that you could use to identify how to invest within King County. And before I go to the video, Bookda, you had a question.
Yeah, there's a really important comment and question in the chat, Allison, that this is really beautiful and powerful work. First of all, yes, we agree. Good job, Allison. But also saying that they would never have imagined this kind of work coming from the Port of Seattle. How did the leadership receive this? How is your leadership affecting and influencing the region and the equity work for the rest of the organizations and municipalities? If it's okay with you, Allison, I'll say a couple of comments and then turn it over to you. That it is true that this work, the index work, comes with a number of other changes organization-wide. The Office of Equity was created just 2.5 years ago, and we started right away on the index work. But this has been an incredible time of transformation at the Port of Seattle. We've also conducted a really deep assessment of our policing department and practices. We're doing an assessment of women of color's status at the Port of Seattle. That's a really deep assessment going on for a number of months. We're doing an organization-wide assessment and survey. We're doing a pay equity survey. There is a lot of work that is being pushed forward. And honestly, I've done this equity work in multiple jurisdictions, and I think that if it hadn't been for the crisis of COVID, the racial uprisings and the social justice crisis around the country, it would have taken a lot longer to get here. But our commission, our leadership is absolutely on board, and our employees have done a great job of rolling up their sleeves and pushing for this work to move forward faster and for it to get implemented and to see results. And on the question with other municipalities, we are really mindful of partnering with others around the country. We're, of course, members of GARE, which I think there are probably a lot of GARE members around, on this call. We are a member of a King County-wide consortium that is meeting about equity. We are working with port partners on the West Coast. So there's a lot of ways that we're looking at learning from one another and working with each other. Allison, do you want to add?
No, I think that's great. I think that you answered it perfectly. The only thing I would add is that leadership, again, I emphasize that when we talk about census data, using your partners, using your departments to gather their data makes them get buy-in again. So you don't get a lot of pushback. Again, thinking about your color association, thinking about how you don't blame and shame gets you buy-in from the community. So I think it comes across a lot easier when you do that groundwork. It's easier to make a map, I say, but to do the groundwork of involving community, talking to departments, asking the data they have, asking how the community wants to see themselves, it takes around a good 6 to 8 months just to do that groundwork and get that buy-in. So then it comes across a lot more easily where people want to be involved in it.
Allison.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. You got another hand up and you've got a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to.
Go ahead.
The question in the chat is, did you look at the number of residents who work within close proximity to where they live? I sometimes see a mismatch of jobs and resident skills and was curious if this is in the index.
Yes, so we did the job. So for the job proximity, that was the data point we used. And then we broke it down again by the types of jobs. So then we would understand what kind of investments in those communities we want to do or emphasize. Again, construction, manufacturing, and industrial trades. Hands up. Gupta, did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, thank you. This is awesome job. Great work you're doing there. I wanted to go back to your comment previously where you said that you weren't using the census group data, but you were working with the regional partners to get that data. And I just wanted you to comment on how difficult it was or how much more time consuming it was as compared to, just lifting that census data and using it, because we're trying to do something similar here in Durham area, not as intense as what you are doing. And we have used census block data, but I would definitely like to understand, a little bit about it.
It was a lot of MOUs, memorandum of understandings, a lot of signatures, and just kind of, I came here new. I basically I came from the National Science Foundation and National Institute of Health, so I was in DC for around 15 years. So I came here, which is my hometown, Washington State, Puyallup, Washington, exactly. So I knew no one. I knew no one. I've been here for like 4 years, maybe 4.5 now. And it was a very having a leadership to give me the leeway to be like, I want to talk to the public works department. I don't want to talk to the director. I call her worker bees. I want to talk to the worker bees. I want to see what kind of data they have. I want to talk to who has the voting participation rate. Oh, auditors. I never knew that the auditors, because I came from a very federal level. So I was like, is there a way that you can connect me with the auditor's office and I can get the voting participation rates? So it did take a while. I think that this is my second map in the region. I did the first one in the city of Tacoma and the one here. And it usually takes around, I said, estimate 6 to 8, but it's really a year of just first, and because I didn't have those relationships, trying to be introduced and getting the trust and understanding that I don't want an Excel spreadsheet that you've been keeping in your drawer forever on paper. Like, I need something that I think is accurate data, that is authoritative data, I call it. And then how do you define what is authoritative data? Well, I always try not to use anything that's older than 2 years, but at least has a history of at least 5 to 7 years in your draft and it's clean. If you just started collecting data and it's only a year old, I feel like I don't really trust the accuracy or the reflective or authority of that data. But something that's 5 to 7 years old, that's been developed and used for a long period of time, those are the small data standardizations that I try to engulf in my work and my methodologies personally. But it does take a very long time to build those relationships, build trust, and to make sure that people, when I say trust, that they don't think you're using their data to attack them. I don't even want to blame and shame my own departments. I just want to use your information to gather and educate. And because it's a score of 21 data points, no one usually feels like they're being like, well, the street light situation or the aerial street trafficking. And you're like, because it's all engulfed, it doesn't really show you like how one number affects or heightens or lowers a number. But it does take a lot of trust and working and having good leadership to give you that time. I think that we're a very fast turning thing where they're like, create a map, use the census, blah, blah, blah. But you get a lot of pushback, especially by people of color in tribal communities and people with disabilities that do not think that census data reflects them. And so it's understanding, like right now, I've been trying to figure out a solid disability data point that I would like to use, not in the index, but as an overlay, because I know people do not feel like they are represented accurately in census data when it comes to that. So it's those little things. Sorry, a pop-up just came up.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So I'll demonstrate this video and then I'll take more questions and show you a live thing. So again, to go back, this is a program that we invested in with our city grants program, and it's showing how we were able to analyze and understanding that they needed manufacturing, construction, industrial jobs in this area, using that data and then being able to justify investing in this community.
My name is Demetria Lynn Strickland. I am the Executive Director for the Aerospace Joint Apprenticeship Committee, better known as AJAC. So AJAC is a 501c3 nonprofit apprenticeship service provider. We develop and implement employer-driven apprenticeship programs across the state of Washington, open to all employers in this state. AJAC partnered with the Port of Seattle, the City of Kent, the Kent Economic Development, as well as Green River College to develop the Manufacturing Employee Retention Program. So the program was designed to provide support to the Kent Valley manufacturers in the form of tuition-free short-term training, as well as wage reimbursements, as well as structured on-the-job training. And then the main purpose of this was to be able to retain a lot of those entry-level position employees, workers who were disproportionately impacted by situations like this. So employers were able to train, retain, and rehire employees through the manufacturing employee retention program. Even prior to the pandemic, manufacturing as well as many other industries were suffering from a shortage of workers. It really has helped those small and medium-sized employers that really employ a lot of the people within the community. So that has helped them to remain somewhat financially stable during and also as we come out of the pandemic. Even prior to the pandemic, we knew that there was inequity in the systems, and I think that through the pandemic, a lot of this has been highlighted now that we're actually talking about the elephant in the room of inequality within our different systems. You know, I think programs like this, it really does focus on communities and individuals within those communities to be able to get them into the pipeline to have careers, not just jobs, but to be able to get their foot in the door and have access to career pathways.
So that's a demonstration of using equity indexing and data to understand how you can put your resources in areas and make it further. And we were trying to go, we'll try to do that more throughout.
My name is Demetria Lynn Strickland.
So our next steps, and then I'll show you kind of the website, is creating more of those case studies in that analysis and embedding our department more into other departments to just kind of work with them. I think everyone thinks that you come up with the index map and you're saying put money here, here, and here, but it's also working about how policy and programs and understanding how we can work with them. And as someone said previously, like how long does this take? I think some of the case studies I've done in the past usually maybe takes even 2 or 3 months just to get an outcome. So you can work and be like, I'm not saying like invest in this community because of X. It's like, how do you do your work? Because I am not the expert when it comes to sewage management or restoration, water restoration. But how can I help you identify communities on what is needed in that community? So working with more case studies, building better partnerships, as someone said, working with UW. I have a small group of people I try to meet with a couple of times a year, just to, sometimes we just talk and just hear about like, what are you working on? And UW is part of that group, and Seattle is part of that group, and King County. And it's not really led by anyone. It's more just coming together and just saying, what are you doing with equity and data? I call us the equity data nerds. So like, how are you working with equity? How are you doing mapping tools? How did you identify? Where did you get your resources? And then story maps. I think that creating those videos, because I don't want to just focus on the past or the negativity of it. I want to show in story maps and videos and photos about the investments that the city is, the Port of Seattle is putting in those communities. And then looking over periods of time to see how those investments have changed those equity numbers or changed those unemployment numbers. So looking at forecasting and longevity of this program. So I'm going to show you and demonstrate what the website looks like, but you can interrupt me at any time. So this is our landing page, kind of shows you kind of what our 4 categories are and definition of it. Once you hit explore map, it'll give you this map. It shows you the equity index from very high to very low. It gives you this basic demographic information. I think this is super helpful. Let's talk about top countries of immigration. If you're thinking about translating materials, people immediately say, we need to translate everything in Spanish. But for King County, the top countries of immigration is China. So maybe you need to translate instead of Spanish as your first one, translate in Chinese. Like that is something, those are the small little things that maybe if you're not into analyzing, it gives you some basic information that if you're going to do community outreach, you can immediately go to this website. And if you wanted to drill down, which I'll show you, into a community, it'll tell you what are those community, what is that community made of. We have, it goes into the 4 categories: economy, livability, accessibility, and environment. And it shows you kind of like, I call it user friendly or nice little like icons of all this information. And then you can also go into search, custom area, map options, and reset. So with the search option, you can search. This is a demonstration of where I search just Federal Way. You can see that the numbers change from where it stands overall and where it stands in each of the categories, and where these are the differences for that community. Click it. In this search, you can search by address, zip code, city, U.S. congressional district. If I was doing it for just a small town, I would do it maybe by the district for that town or city. And it'll populate for you. Where I said what city, I said, what's another one? Let's try Kent, Clint, and then it re-aggregates it just for Kent. Sometimes it takes a little bit to load, and I'll say like, well, that area, which I was showing you before, is very low. And again, these are the job estimate totals for that area. Tells you education attainment, tells you poverty rate, tells you, and it tells you unemployment. This is livability. So if you wanted to, or other thing I would like to do is one time have it side by side. But so this was Federal Way. Their life expectancy is 79. In Kent, their life expectancy is 80. This is still low, and this is low, but it shows you kind of how two different cities that are really next, kind of close to each other, how they different in just life expectancy alone. And then, as someone said, like, these are the jobs within 30 minutes by transit. So I always say that you want to be able to get to your job by transit, because we don't want to be car dependent. So you still should be able to make a living to get to your job. This also, you can customize if you wanted to by just doing like a triangle. Can I do it today? Let's see. And it'll snap it into the census block groups. And this kind of does our Muckleshoot tribes. If no one's ever known, there's not a lot of shape files for tribes. So it's hard to put that in there. So sometimes it's easier to snap it and just do a free form. And it'll tell you the population. It'll tell you that overall information, tell you the jobs, 81 construction jobs. And there's not even enough information for manufacturing jobs in an area, but a lot for government, obviously. And so it kind of gives you that information over there. This is very low compared to what we had in our economy, or that was livability. If we wanted to, now I'm just gonna start playing. Why not just start playing? For the livability, actually, livability is 81, but then you can start diving down, like, why is this very low compared to Federal Way or compared to Kent, which will have that information kind of in this. You can print it if you wanted to, and you can give it out to elected official if he was going out to a community, and you could print it out, give them that information, and it will give them the basic demographic information. These are, if you wanted to, we didn't do an overlay, but we did do where it looks like when it comes to people of color. So that is an option. And then it will also do colors for each of the different indicator categories that we have. So this is kind of like what we have right now, but it's always building better and stronger. And we're trying to figure out any way to like change it. Any ideas I'm always open to. But any questions? That's kind of the end of my demo. I did 55 minutes. I didn't do that bad. Sometimes I can talk forever. Anything else? How did I do, Jay? My monitor. Thanks for the clap, Jay. Jay's my partner in crime. There's only an office of two.
You did great, Allison. We have plenty of time for questions if people have any questions. And I see one hand up. Derek. Oh, maybe two hands. No, Derek, go ahead.
And I'm just going to put my information here in case anyone wants to email me. If you don't feel comfortable asking questions here, you can gladly email me.
Hi, this is Derek. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you, Derek. I did hear you, Derek.
Okay, while Derek is figuring out their situation, it looks like Jeff Hovet. I don't know if I said your last name right, Jeff. Jeff, go ahead. Do you have a question?
You did. Thank you very much. And thank you, Allison, very much. So I've had an opportunity to see the index and it looks highly interactive. I appreciate that. If you were to give me a hint of where I should start, what would you say?
I would say my 2 starting points would be understanding what the community needs and how they define equity, and then working with your departments and understanding what are the data sources they have. Not a lot of people, I wanted sidewalk data and I couldn't find sidewalk data for everyone. So I had to compromise with aerial streets. Sometimes it's just like understanding what kind of data sources we have, how can I use it, and if it's by census tract or census block. I think those are the small little details, because people might have something that's kind of and I was doing county, so sometimes it was hard to figure out with 38 cities who all has what and what we have that's countywide. So understanding the region that you're evaluating, understanding the community, and understanding your departments, and building a small kind of internal and external work group. I always say, and people hate this, I never want elected officials in my group, and no one that's like above kind of like directors. I always want worker bees. Worker bees know where the bodies are buried. Not really, just where the data is buried. But like, you want that kind of like groundwork. And then they kind of are like, which we're developing a change team. They're the ones that are your people that kind of advocate within the department. It's like, I worked on this for 6 months. It was really awesome. We should start using this when it comes to public works or sewage or restoring water waste. Those, like, people get really excited when they are involved. And so I would say those would be like my first steps.
Thank you.
Yes, this will be available in a shape file and a CSV file.
Hi, Allison. This is Derek. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Sorry about my sound issues I was having. So I work for City of Tukwila, and I think this tool can be really useful when people are using it for its intended purpose. I'm also, though, a little bit curious about, any advice you have on how we can not let it sort of stigmatize communities. And so, for instance, in Tukwila's case, the livability data is based partly on the crime data, which is accurate. I mean, the crime data, because Tukwila deals with the crime data all the time. In the past, we've been, shown as the highest crime city in the United States and all of that. Different companies publish that. And it's based on correct statistics, but it's sort of like misunderstanding the statistics, because what it's doing is it'll take total crime but put it on a per capita basis. And so we have the largest mall in the Pacific Northwest, and we also are a very small city population wise. So we have 150,000 people a day in the city of Tukwila, but only 20,000 people live here. And so, yes, we have way more shoplifting per capita than any city in the United States, probably. But so what happens is there's this sort of perception out there that Tukwila is a really high crime city. And so then some people are worried about moving into Tukwila or living here or staying here or investing here. And so if any advice you have on how we can.
Yeah, I brought it up. So this is Tukwila. And so I say everything's equally weighed. So it's not like the crime data would overwhelm your overall index score. You can look at another thing. We'll see if this works. We call it distribution of data. So this marker tells you where you are in the distribution relatively to all of King County. So you're at at the very low mark for just unemployment rate. This is just for one data point. You can kind of look at what's the median household income, education attainment rate, service. Oh, that's very interesting. You guys have maybe because of the whole the mall that you're saying. So I wouldn't say crime is like the data point. I would say there's so many other things And then the fact that you can look at it relatively to all of King County. Does that make sense?
Well, could you go, you were on livability, could you scroll down and see the crime risk little box at the bottom? That's the issue I'm saying. So if people look at that box, I think that's probably based on per capita base. So if you look at our property crime risk and personal compared to the average, you know, we're double the national average for personal crime. We're probably 7 times higher than the national average for property crime. But because property crime includes shoplifting and all that, this is a per capita thing. And so I guess if somebody looked at that chart, like that particular thing, they might misunderstand it. That's all. I'm just
Yeah, I understand. I try to how this all started. Let's see how this all started. How did my career started in Washington State? I'm in Puyallup, which I worked in the city of Tacoma, and the Washington State environmental health disparities map. Tacoma always looks like the redheaded stepchild to Seattle. That's what I say, and I'll say it openly. So I was like, but I want to evaluate Tacoma. I don't want to see what we're relative to King County or Pierce County or Seattle. I want to evaluate our city. What we're trying to do, which I think would be very helpful for you guys in the city of Tukwila, is eliminating all those other factors, like you said, like how are you relative, or how are you compared to King County? How are you compared to Seattle? How are you compared to Tacoma? To have this aggregate on the fly, which is something that I'm trying to advocate for region-wide, that you would be able to evaluate just your city to say, like, where are the nuances within your city? And I think that kind of is helpful when you're making decisions in your community and decisions in your city, to say, like, I understand that, like you said, like nationwide, our crime rate is higher than others, or compared to the nation or the city or Seattle, but we just want to focus on our town and where are the hot pockets within our town. And that's why I think it would be really helpful for a lot of the smaller towns around King County to have this aggregate. When I say aggregate on the fly, it means that it would recalculate these numbers to focus on just your city. And I think that's what we're all kind of missing. And that would, again, help, I think, with the, like you said, the stigma that you're just like, I understand, like Tacoma kept saying, we will not have the bus routes that Seattle has, but where can we get more bus routes in Tacoma? Where are the bus routes missing? Because our public transportation is maybe not as robust. And it was like, when you compared us to anywhere else and compared us to Seattle, it was just, it didn't compare correctly. We were always like in the negative. So I think smaller towns like you, it's like, if we as a big port can advocate to do this on a big level to re-aggregate it for you guys, then I think that would help with your analysis. Does that make sense?
Well, I think we should just have a separate conversation later. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but thank you for taking the question. And I think overall it can be a very helpful tool.
Derek, I do also want to call out that you have an offer to connect in the chat from Diana, who looks like she's done some research on what you're talking about.
And if you email me, Derek, I can connect you. Oh, she already put her email address in there. Yeah.
No,
she's really good. Like, I work with her and she's awesome with Seattle. Not worked with her a lot, but I've talked to her a couple of times. How about that?
Yeah, thank you. I'll email you. My concern is not that the city of Tukwila would misuse the data. My concern is that there's there's other people that look at data and they misinterpret data. So but that's a whole different topic. So we can go to other questions.
Any other questions? I see people. We have around 10 more minutes. Again, if you don't want to ask questions now, you can go ahead and email me. That's why I'm keeping this slide up. Feel free to email me anytime. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.